Thank you for joining Jennifer Schaus and Associates in our 2019 Webinar Wednesday series. We're coming to you live from downtown Washington, D.C. Our webinars are every Wednesday, and you can find the upcoming schedule on our website. Past webinars and all recordings are also on our website and on our YouTube channel, along with over 160 other recordings on federal contracting topics. All are complimentary. If you have questions for our speaker today, you can reach out to them directly with the contact information you'll see on the last slide. All right, that's just a little bit about us. We are a Washington, D.C. based firm and provide services to federal contractors. This ranges from market analysis reports to proposal writing and also post-award compliance. More information is on our website, so please visit us there. We do offer advertising on our newsletter, so please reach out to this email if you'd like more information on that. All right, our speaker today is Anne-Marie Tavella, and she's going to be going over HUBZones, Qualifications, and Special Allowances. Thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you. This is, again, HUBZones, Qualifications, and Special Allowances. We will be discussing how to qualify as a HUBZone company, where HUBZones are located and how that's determined, and what the federal contracting opportunities are for HUBZone companies. Next slide. Let's see. There we go. So HUBZone stands for Historically Underutilized Business Zones. The purpose of this program is to help small businesses in certain communities gain access to federal contracts. Basically, the SBA seeks to increase employment opportunities and increase investment in areas that don't have a lot of businesses and or are otherwise economically depressed. Next slide. The HUBZone program is governed by Part 13 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 126, and the requirements to be a HUBZone in some ways are fairly straightforward. You must be a small business under your company's primary NAICS code under the Federal Contracting Regulations. So you must qualify as small. You must be at least 51% owned and controlled by a U.S. citizen, a community development corporation, an agricultural cooperative, a Native Hawaiian organization, or an Indian tribe. But what that also means is that HUBZone companies can be minority owned by federal corporations or federal individuals, but the company must still meet the size requirement. So you can't have a minority owner who's a large business unless there's a authorized joint venture, which we'll talk about near the end of the presentation. But you can have owners that aren't U.S. citizens or meeting these other requirements in order to be a HUBZone. You just can't have them be the majority owner. The company must have its principal office located in a HUBZone. This is an important requirement. The SBA has gone after companies that have tried to set up satellite offices or shell offices in HUBZone businesses where the real company is really operated out of another office somewhere else, and then they try to put in 3 or 4 employees into a HUBZone area, and the SBA has rooted those out. A lot of times competitors look for that. If you're bidding on a HUBZone contract, they will protest, and often those types of protests can result in you losing your HUBZone status and your company overall potentially losing the right to bid on any federal contracts, not just set-aside contracts. So there's the risk of suspension or debarment if the SBA determines the violation is egregious enough. So it's important to meet the principal office requirement. You also have to have at least 35% of your employees live in a HUBZone, and that applies at the time of offer and at award. The employees do not have to live in the same HUBZone as the main office. They can live in a different HUBZone, but at least 35% must live in the HUBZone. Next slide, please. Like I just mentioned, the company must be eligible at the time of offer and at award. This may seem like a fairly easy requirement to meet, but if you lose one employee sometimes, especially when you're dealing with a small company, if one employee moves, quits, has to get terminated, you can lose your HUBZone status for that time period. And if the time of award that's occurred, there is case law that establishes that you will not be eligible for that HUBZone contract. The SBA, there have been requests to them to revisit this rule because it's considered to be fairly harsh, particularly when usually this is outside the company's control. You may have a plan in place to replace an employee who leaves, but often the time period between bid submission and award isn't long enough to really help you remedy a problem when it arises. So it is really important to keep that in mind as you're bidding, and that you're communicating with your employees so you can anticipate potential issues. Sometimes it's out of your control, but right now the rule is fairly harsh. So if you lose or you have a change in employee status, you will lose your award even if you win the bid. So you have to keep an eye on that, and we'll see if maybe the SBA lessens the harshness of this rule over time, but that is the current rule. Next slide. Once you're awarded, you can lose employees or change the employee makeup without losing the contract. 13 CFR 126.602 requires companies attempt to maintain compliance. So if you do have a change in your employee status after award, it's an attempt to maintain requirement. There is an expectation that in good faith you will try to remedy the loss of maybe it's more than one employee, but remedy the issue so you do get back to that 35% requirement. And it's important if you have any intent to bid on future contracts, you have to keep your status. So it's important more beyond just the contract that you would be performing. It's recommended that HUBZone companies have an active compliance plan, and this would require you to have, potentially a policy that will require employees to notify you as soon as possible if they are planning on moving, or at the very least notifying you as soon as they do move. You have to, additionally, you should have periodic checks of the HUBZone Map, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, but you want to make sure that both your office and your employees remain in HUBZone areas if you're intending to really continue on in the HUBZone program. If you want to stay compliant and stay certified, you have to make sure that your employees and your business remain in HUBZone areas. We'll talk a little bit more in a second about how that can change. So it's important to have a plan in place, and it's important to really be prepared for changes to ensure that you can act quickly, because even though you won't lose the contract you're working on, you won't be able to bid on new contracts like we just talked about, and you could potentially lose, if you had bid on a contract and been awarded, you could lose that award. So you want to make sure that you're as prepared as possible to deal with any changes to your company's HUBZone status. Next slide. So HUBZones are determined, this slide's a little bit, it's not incorrect. The primary determination of where HUBZones are located is determined by data from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, but the XBA actually collects data from various agencies, including the Bureau of Indian Affairs and other agencies that track economic status of various areas. So, but the primary one is the Department of Housing that collects and releases this data to the SBA. HUBZones can be an entire county or just a certain tract of land. They call these census tracts that are within urban and non-urban areas. In order to usually for a census tract to be designated a HUBZone, the poverty rate has to be about 25%, or at least 50% or more of people and households in that area have incomes below 60% of the area median household income. That's not necessarily a hard and fast rule, but it is the general criteria the SBA is looking at. Counties can only be designated in a HUBZone if they're in a non-metropolitan area. then the statistics they look at counties is whether the median income is less than 80% of the non-metropolitan state median household income, or the unemployment rate is at least 140% of either the state or the national unemployment rate. So that's how they generally determine whether a county or a census tract meets the HUBZone criteria of basic, economic depression. There are also other areas that may be determined to be a HUBZone, which is Native American land, and as well, disaster areas and areas close to near closed military installations. Disaster areas and closed military installations are temporary HUBZones. They generally they have a time limit applied to how long they have HUBZone status. I mentioned the map earlier. The map reflecting the current qualified HUBZone areas is available at sba.gov. Let's take a look at that. Next slide. This is a picture of the HUBZone map. It's difficult to see in a static photo, but it is a dynamic map. So if you go to sba.gov and you scroll over this map, it's honestly a little overwhelming because a lot of information will start jumping out at you, because if you can see here in this picture, the HUBZones almost look like they're on top of each other. And part of that is because the SBA has color coded this map. So you can see on the side, there's the key. The dark blue is the census tracts, the red are the counties, the light blue is Indian land, and then you have the non-solid color coding with the stripes and the dots. Then you have the redesignated areas, disaster areas, and closed base areas. So when you're using this map, if you go to the area where you live, you can zoom in and scroll over various areas within your own community or within your state and see which areas have been designated HUBZones, which type of HUBZone, and for temporary HUBZones, you can see how long they will be a HUBZone. It's a really it's a pretty cool feature. It's, I think, sometimes a little difficult to use just because the areas can be very close together, and sometimes you can see they basically overlap, and sometimes they do overlap. So it's worth spending some time playing with the map if you've never done that before, particularly if you're looking to open a business in a HUBZone area. You want to make sure you know what type of HUBZone it is. For example, if it's a temporary HUBZone, then you know for sure that your business is going to have to probably move unless that gets designated as a permanent HUBZone at some point. There's really no such thing as a permanent HUBZone, though. I should correct myself, because even areas that are counties, census tracts, the solid colors can be redesignated, as you can see with the stripes. Next slide. So redesignated areas are basically expiring HUBZones. This is a little zoom in on one area that is a county disaster area. So that's a temporary HUBZone. You can tell by the striped designation. And when you scroll over a temporary HUBZone, that is usually a base closure area or a disaster area, it will give you the expiration date. So it'll tell you how long this area is going to be a HUBZone, and how long you could potentially operate within that area and still qualify for HUBZone status. The redesignated areas, as I mentioned, are areas that were HUBZones but are now have their economic makeup of that area has changed, and so the SBA has decided they are no longer HUBZones. Upon making that determination, the HUBZone then has 3 years before it loses the area has 3 years before it loses its status. So if you are located in an area that gets redesignated, you don't immediately lose your status. You have 3 years to figure out whether you're going to move, whether you're going to lose your HUBZone status and move on, or it gives you basically a grace period. And one thing I should clarify is, the SBA doesn't actually decide which areas are HUBZones. They determine from the data obtained from HUD and all the other agencies which areas have the data requirements to meet the HUBZone criteria. That's determined by statute. The SBA doesn't make subjective determinations as to what areas should be hub zones. It's really a data question. So it's really the SBA's role is identifying which areas meet those data requirements. They don't decide by themselves that an area meets that is a hub zone, and they have to be backed up by data to make that determination. Next slide. I mentioned for very briefly earlier that you can have a large company partner with a hub zone, and the SBA now has basically it's called the All Small MentorProtege Program, which allows all small businesses, including hub zone businesses, to have a mentor, which would be often a large company. It doesn't have to be a large company. That works with the HUBZone company to help them gain experience and gain contracts, and you are permitted to enter into joint ventures with your approved mentor and bid on contracts together. Your JV agreements have to be approved by the SBA, but the opportunity is there. They also changed the rule recently that allow HUBZone businesses to enter into joint ventures with other small businesses. For a long time, the rule required HUBZone businesses to only joint venture with other HUBZone businesses, which was fairly limiting. So now they can joint venture with women-owned businesses, 8A businesses, just run-of-the-mill small businesses, and provided that the JV, provided that each company is considered small, then the JV will be considered small even after the companies are combined for the joint venture. So it gives you an opportunity to work with other companies, potentially companies that have different experience and different knowledge bases and abilities, so you can bid on different kinds of contracts that maybe you wouldn't normally be eligible for, especially if you have limited past performance data. That is really helpful as well if you enter into a mentor-protege agreement, because you can rely on the mentor's experience often when you're bidding on a contract. So you want to really explore these joint venture opportunities. They present a very positive and lucrative opportunity to bid on contracts that you wouldn't normally be eligible for. And partnering with a mentor is a win-win really on both sides, because the mentor then is eligible to bid on contracts that it wouldn't often be eligible for if it is a large business, because once you have the joint venture between a mentor and protege, it's deemed small as long as the protege qualifies. So large companies then have the ability to bid on small business contracts they don't normally have the opportunity to bid on, which a lot of companies find very appealing. So it's not usually too difficult to find a mentor if you are a HUBZone company, protege company that's seeking a mentor. Next slide. Now we're getting to the special allowances. The joint venture bidding touched on that, but why would you want to be a HUBZone? Well, it's because the federal government, which is the largest federal contractor, awards at least 3% of all federal contracting dollars to HUBZone certified small businesses. Well, that is its goal, and I think it does. They do, award fair amount, and we'll talk about the numbers in a moment. But HUBZone certification allows you to bid on a lot of contracts that you wouldn't normally be eligible for. You are allowed to bid on set-aside contracts, which are only for HUBZone companies, sole source awards, which don't require competition, and you also get a 10% price evaluation preference in contracts that are full and open competition. So you get an advantage on open awards, and you get the opportunity to bid on contracts that are not open to full competition. Next slide. And these are the numbers, which are fairly telling. There's a lot of money to be had in HUBZone contracts. $9.8 billion in contracts were awarded to HUBZone certified businesses by the federal government in fiscal year 2018. Within that is about $2 billion in set-aside contracts, which only HUBZones could bid on, about $112 million in sole source awards where there was no competition, about $100 million through the price evaluation preference, and about 1.8 billion in open competition solicitations. And the largest by far is 5.7 billion awarded with another small business preference. So those are contracts that may be limited to HUBZones and 8A, or just all small or women-owned, or the service disabled veteran-owned small businesses. So those are awarded together, and that is by far the largest category of contracts that were awarded to HUBZones in fiscal year 2018. So there's a lot of opportunity here. If you are interested, or you currently live in an area that qualifies as a HUBZone, as you saw from the map earlier, there's a lot of large swaths of the country qualify as HUBZone for various reasons, and so there is a lot of money and federal contracting dollars to obtain if you live and work in these areas, or you open a business in these areas and your employees live there, and you do get a lot of federal contracting benefits from that. So that is the end of our presentation this morning. I will turn it back over to Jay Sosh.
Thank you so much for joining us today. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out at the email or phone number shown on your screen. And this concludes the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.